On a freezing night in Anchorage, Alaska, winter had settled over the city and far north. Long darkness, bitter air, and streets that felt quieter than they should.
Good evening, everyone. The massive search for missing barista Samantha Koenig is over, but it's not the news family and friends were hoping for.
Maria, Mike, nothing specifically related to the abduction of Samantha Koenig. He spoke very briefly, short phrases, yes, Your Honor, no, Your Honor, things like that. He did plead not guilty.
But one night, a young woman vanished. At first, it looked like a beginning of a missing person case. Someone disappears, police start searching, the family waits for answer, and everyone hopes there is still time. Then a ransom demand appeared, and with the came photograph that seemed to change everything.
Thousands of flyers cry out for help on nearly every street corner.
The image appeared to show that the victim was still alive, and for a brief moment, that meant hope.
Many people who just wish they could do something.
They would err on the side of finding this girl before she got hurt.
On the talk radio airwaves today, callers wondered why police won't release the surveillance video which captured Koenig's abduction.
This was never a rescue story, and that image was never proof of life. By the time it was taken, the young woman in the photograph was already dead.
Discovered in Matanuska Lake, what investigators believed to be the body of Samantha Koenig.
What began as a disappearance was about to become something far darker, not only because of what had been done to her, but because of what investigators would eventually uncover behind it. This case would lead to one of the most disturbing criminal investigators in a modern American true crime. The young woman at the center of the case was Samantha Koenig. She was 18 years old, living in Anchorage, Alaska, and working at a small coffee stand called Common Grounds. On the night of February 1st, 2012, Samantha was working alone. It should have been an ordinary shift, serving customer, waiting for closing time, expecting to head home like any other night. But sometime during that shift, Samantha disappeared.
Dispatch, may I help you?
Hello. I'm calling from out of state, or I would have called the emergency line. One of our coffee shops last night, it appears got, from what we can tell, it looks like it got robbed, and we're just all now starting to figure this out.
Okay, when you say robbed, did somebody come there with a gun and demand money, or did somebody break into it after it was closed?
Well, while our barista was there, it looks like it was right about 8 o'clock. The camera's time is off,
okay, so
and
sir,
none of us have been...
I'm going to have to ask you to confirm what I just asked. Was there a person that walked up to the coffee stand and held it up
Yes.
at gunpoint?
As far as I can tell from my cameras, yes.
And your
there was someone
barista
that came
did
while
not
we were
call
open.
the police department last night?
It looks she left with this person, so we're assuming she's in danger.
She had not simply stopped answering her phone. She had not just changed her plans. Very quickly, it became clear that it was not something much more serious.
Authorities say this surveillance video from Alaska shows Keys abducting Koenig from her job. They'll say Keys had never met Koenig before. They say he showed a gun, demanded money, tied her up, and then placed her in the back of his pickup truck.
This was not a remote road, in the middle of nowhere. It was not an isolated trail or abandoned building. It was a small coffee stand in a city. It suggests a person bold enough to act in a public and careful enough to disappear before anyone could stop him. As a concern turned into a panic, the case moved beyond the uncertainty of a normal missing person report. Then came a ransom demand and visit a photograph that seemed to tell Samantha's family she was still alive.
About 6,000 people have now signed up for updates from the Help Find Samantha Koenig Facebook page. Alaska Governor Sean Parnell even shared it with his followers. Our thoughts and prayers are with Samantha Koenig, he writes.
For a family desperate for hope, the image meant everything. But in reality, it was one of the cruelest parts of the entire case. The photo did not prove Samantha could still be saved. It only hid the truth of what had already been done to her. At some point, after Samantha disappeared, her family was given something that changed the emotional weight of the case immediately. A ransom demand, and attached to it photograph. The image seemed to show Samantha alive, and for people who love her, that meant one thing above all else: hope. Hope that she was still out there. Hope that she was still time. Hope that if the right steps were taken, she might still be brought home alive. And in a case like this, hope can be blinding.
Clearly, word is getting out, and even more local businesses are now offering to help.
We've offered up use of our helicopters if one is needed to help the family out and to help the police department out.
When a family is desperate for any sign of life, even the smallest piece of evidence can feel like everything. But this photograph carries a strange, unique visit. Even before the full truth was known, something about it did not sit right. Samantha's father would later said that her hair looked wrong. It had been braided in a way he said she normally never wore. It was a small detail, the kind of details that might seem meaningless to anyone else. But to the people who knew her, it stood out immediately. And in a case built on a deception, the detail mattered. The photo was not proof of Samantha was still alive. It was part of the lie. By the time that image was taken, Samantha Koenig was already dead.
A worst-case scenario showed up just outside Kevin Sturgeon's house.
I just thought people were ice fishing. That's all I thought. I had no idea intentions on what was going on.
And all it took was the Anchorage Police Department Monday to make it official.
Earlier today, a forensic dive team discovered in Matanuska Lake what investigators believed to be the body of Samantha Koenig.
The person responsible had staged the photograph to create the illusion that she could be still saved. That illusion bought time. It created false hope, and it turned the case into something even crueler than kidnapping. This was not just a murder. It was physiological manipulation directed at the people still praying she would come home. And once investigators began to understand what that image real was, the case changed completely.
Maria, the place that became so well known as the headquarters in the search for Samantha Koenig has tonight become a makeshift memorial. You can see all the flowers that people have left behind in memory of Samantha as news of her death spreads across town tonight.
They were no longer just looking for a missing woman. They were looking for someone capable of planning, staying, and controlling the story long after the victim was already gone. And that realization would eventually lead them to a man far more danger than they first understood. After the ransom demand and their staged photograph, this case was no longer just about finding a missing woman. After the ransom demand and the staged photograph, this case was no longer just about finding a missing woman. It had become a race to identify the person behind it. Whoever had taken Samantha had already shown something deeply disturbing. He was not just violent, he was patient enough to create false hope, calculated enough to manipulate a family, and confident enough to believe he could stay ahead of investigators. But cases like this leave trails behind. Not always obvious ones, not immediately, but enough for investigators to begin pulling the story apart, piece by piece. And once they did, the image of desperate kidnapper began to change. This no longer looked like a panic, it looked like planned. The abduction had been deliberate. The ransom demand had been deliberate. The photograph had been deliberate. And that meant the person behind it was thinking several moves ahead. As investigators followed the trail, the case began to move away from uncertainty and towards someone very real. Not an unknown face in the dark, not some passing theory. A real suspect. A man who by that point was no longer just connected to Samantha Koenig's disappearance, but to what had been done to her and after she was already dead.
Beyond that, investigators wouldn't answer many more questions about anything, including what the connection is between Israel Keys and Samantha Koenig. They say they have to keep that information close to their chest. Now, the FBI says if you have any information about Keys or the truck he was driving, they want to hear from you. Call 1-800-CALL-FBI.
The man was Israel Keys. And once investigators began to close on him, the case changing again. The deeper investigators went, the more they began to realize this was about more than Samantha's abduction. It was about understanding who this man really was and how much more might be hiding behind him. At first glance, Israel Keys did not look like kind of person people imagine when they think about of serial killer. And that might be one of the reasons why this case became so disturbing. It was a case that exposed something much bigger.
Investigators say Israel Keys, who took his own life in jail, committed 11 homicides across the country between 2001 and 2012.
By the time investigators focused on Israel Keys, they were no longer looking at a simple kidnapping case. They were looking at a man who seemed to operate with unusual level of patience, control, and planning. And that is part of what made him so disturbing. Israel Keys did not present himself like the image most people have in mind when think a serial killer. He didn't look chaotic, he didn't look reckless, and the interviews that followed, he often did not sound panicked at all.
Morning, Israel. How you doing? See better days, all right? Considering? We're gonna do our normal advisement. I have to do your right. First thing I want to ask you is you didn't interrupt anything over at the jail during the interview. No meeting with Bill or anything. You have the right to remain silent. You understand that? Would you? Yeah. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You understand that? Yep. You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present with you while you're being questioned. You understand that? Yep.
Instead, he came across as calm, controlled, at times even conversational. But underneath, the calm was something much darker. Samantha Koenig's case began to reveal that investigators were not dealing with a man who had suddenly snapped. They were dealing with someone who had thought very carefully about what he was doing.
I don't care. He has the information. I just didn't want it all over the media.
All in the public.
Right.
Well, I mean, that goes back to sort of the
But
first...
apparently that's not possible. So can I see that letter?
Yeah.
There's something else in there I want to get.
The abduction was planned, the ransom demand was planned, the stage photograph was planned. Nothing about it felt impulsive. And one investigator started digging deeper. The possibility became harder to ignore. Samantha Koenig may not have been the beginning of his violence. She may have been the case that finally exposed it.
But for us and the people that are in charge of us, what they want, they know that there's potentially up to 10 or 11 victims. So there's 7 or 8 that we don't know where they're at and those kind of things. So what we're getting the pressure to do is find those other people. And so what you don't want us to do is to use conventional police methods to do it.
And in a month that followed, the fear only grew stronger. Authorities would eventually came to believe that Israel Keys was connected to multiple killings across the United States. Not all of them were fully identified. Not all of them were ever fully explained. And that, uncertainly, became part of the made the case so haunting. It was not just what he had done to Samantha Koenig. It was a possibility that Samantha's case had opened the door into something much larger, a trail of violence that had remained hiding until one final victim brought into the surface. Once Keys was arrested, investigators did not just start learning about his crimes, they started learning how carefully he had tried to control the truth about them. Once Israel Keys was in custody, the story did not become simpler. In some ways, it became even more disturbing.
According to the indictment, Keys then left Alaska and boarded a flight to Texas early the next morning. The indictment further alleges that on February the 24th, Keyes sent a text message using Samantha's cellular telephone for the purpose of demanding that ransom money be placed in a bank account connected to the stolen debit card. With the help of the reward money that was generously donated by members of this community, the Koenig family was able to place money into the account.
The man investigators were now dealing with did not came across authentic, reckless, or out of control. If anything, he seemed like the opposite. In interviews that followed Keyes often sounded calm, measured, at times almost casual.
Unknown materials, things I'm assuming were like pieces of things, or like stains that made with blood or something like that. That's based on where they were taken when they generated. Fibers and fragments, same kind of thing. Don't know what that is. Ask about that for all of unknown material. My guess is it's probably there. Hopefully the lab will know.
That's why I call it a ball of unknown material. Maybe you could shed some light on that if you know.
You know what the ball of unknown material is?
I'd like to see it.
And that calm is part of that makes the footage so unsettling. Nothing about him suggests he has been overwhelmed by what he has done. No sense that reality of Samantha Koenig's murder has broke him.
Things like that. He did plead not guilty to the charge of access device fraud, using that stolen debit card to try and get money. Keyes sat in the courtroom today facing the judge as he read off that charge against him. The most we heard from Keyes was him explaining why he didn't have enough money for a lawyer, his voice quivering during...
That is one of the darkest patterns in a case. Even after he was caught, Israel Keyes still wanted control, and in this case, some of that silence may never be fully broken.
Daily News reports Keyes was starting to give detectives details of who he killed in Washington state before he committed suicide. Investigators, both locally and nationally, are now digging up unsolved murder cases to see if there's a link to Keyes. Gardner said the family did not know of Keyes' crimes, but one sister tried to save him spiritually when he visited in March.
Holding back tears as she's pleading with him. And she said even he was holding back tears welling up, said, "You don't know what I've done. You don't know the depths of darkness that I've gone to. You don't know what I've done."
That meant investigators were facing a brutal problem. The person who knew the most was the same person still trying to control what he revealed. So, every interview, every detail, every fragment of information took on a much larger meaning.
His mother and sisters. The pastor says the family is religious and forgiving, but doesn't have hope for Keyes' soul.
He's not in a better place. We do not believe that.
This story begins and ends with Samantha Koenig. In a case like this, it's easy to get lost the size of the investigation, the mystery, the interrogation, the possibility of the victims, and the sheer darkness of the man at the center of it all. Samantha Koenig was not just one more victim in a hiding pattern. Her case was the one that forced that pattern into the open. It was the case that exposed him, the case that brought investigators to his door, and the case that made it impossible for him to disappear back into the dark and keep going. But Samantha Koenig's case proved something important. A person can plan, a person can hide, a person can try to control the story, but they cannot control everything forever. That is why the story still lingers. It's not only about the evil, but long before this became a larger story about Israel Keyes, it was Samantha's life, Samantha's family, Samantha's future that was taken away. Instead, her name became part of the darkest criminal cases in modern America. But it was also her case, and her case alone, that finally brought the darkness into the light. And that may be the closest thing, this story, to justice.
The crime of kidnapping and killing Samantha Koenig, as charged in this indictment, carries a maximum penalty of life or death.